This way is like handling pure fire while soaked in oil. Only the rarest souls, perhaps 1 in 10,000, can traverse it without being completely consumed. Most who attempt it fall into either spiritual lawlessness or despair. Al-Ghazali in Ihya Ulum al-Din. The masters themselves were fully aware of this danger. They established no formal schools, initiated very few students, and left deliberately incomplete written records. They knew that their path could either produce the most liberated saints or cause complete spiritual destruction. In the 9th century, Nishapur, a man named Hamdun al-Qasar, was known throughout the city as a drunkard and wastrel. Shopkeepers spat when he passed. Mothers pulled their children away. Religious authorities denounced him from pulpits. He would stumble through the marketplace at dawn, eyes red and swollen, reeking of the taverns. The righteous crossed the street to avoid contamination from his presence. Yet when he died, something extraordinary happened. The wine merchants came forward to testify that in 20 years, he had never touched a drop of alcohol. The money changers revealed he had secretly paid the debts of countless families facing ruin. The beggars wept for their anonymous benefactor. The man who left food at their doorsteps in the darkness before dawn was gone forever. They found his private journals, written in exquisite Arabic calligraphy, filled with mystical poetry that rivaled Ibn Arabi. His spiritual director later revealed that Hamdun had achieved the station of Fana Fila, complete extinction in God, while maintaining the perfect appearance of spiritual failure. Hamdun had achieved something that sounds impossible. He had become a perfect saint, while appearing to be a perfect sinner. This was the way of the Malamatia, the people of blame, who discovered that the final obstacle to divine union isn't sin, but righteousness itself. Al-Sulami records this exchange that captures their entire philosophy. Teacher, how do I know if my worship is accepted by Allah? When people stop praising your worship. But then how will I know I'm progressing on the path? When you no longer need to know and no longer care to know. The Malamatia had discovered what they called the final veil, not the veil of sin, but the veil of spiritual accomplishment itself. What I'm about to reveal was considered so dangerous that Al-Sulami prefaced his entire treatise with this warning. This path is not for everyone. Most who attempt it fall into actual sin, mistaking the method for licentiousness. The true Malamat walks on a razor's edge between Fana and Fujur. I write this only for those whose hearts Allah has already prepared. Al-Sulami, Risala for Madhhab Ahl al-Malama. The word Fana means mystical extinction, the dissolution of the ego in divine consciousness. Fujur means debauchery and spiritual corruption. The razor's edge between them is where these mystics lived every moment of their lives. They had discovered something that orthodox scholars found heretical, that the ego's final and most sophisticated trap isn't gross sin, it's spiritual pride. The moment we become identified with our own holiness, our prayers, our mystical experiences, our religious knowledge, we've created the subtlest and most impenetrable veil between ourselves and God. Al-Junayd, the master of Baghdad and teacher of teachers, observed, "I have seen nothing more harmful to the seekers than their good opinion of themselves and their actions. The ego that sins knows it is distant from Allah, but the ego that performs righteous acts believes itself close to Allah. and this belief becomes the greatest distance of all. The MALAMAT took this insight to its terrifying logical conclusion. If identification with goodness is the final trap, then they would systematically destroy that identification through what they called ilm al-malama, the science of blame. Here's the esoteric key they discovered through decades of inner observation. They mapped 7 levels of nafs, the ego soul, and found that the 6th level, nafs al-radia, the soul pleased with itself, was actually more dangerous spiritually than the first level of pure animal desire. Why? Because at the 6th level, the ego has learned to co-opt spiritual achievement itself, feeding on mystical experiences and religious accomplishments. The nafs that is pleased with its spiritual stations is further from Allah than the nafs that sins and knows it sins. The sinner may repent, but the spiritually proud has nothing to repent of, and this becomes their damnation. Abu Ali al-Daqqaq. They discovered that conventional spiritual practice often strengthens what it claims to dissolve. Every moment of successful meditation becomes a source of subtle pride. Every act of charity becomes evidence of our goodness. Every mystical experience becomes a spiritual trophy. The very path designed to kill the ego ends up feeding it in increasingly sophisticated ways. The MALAMAT called this phenomenon Gurur al-Salikin, the delusion of the travelers on the spiritual path. They observed that most seekers replace gross ego with subtle ego, crude desires with refined desires, obvious pride with spiritual pride. The transformation is cosmetic. The fundamental structure of self-importance remains intact. Now, for the actual practices, the methods they rarely teach in conventional Sufism, preserved only in the most esoteric manuscripts. The technique of opposite actions, Amal al-Did. This involved performing spiritual actions privately while publicly performing actions that suggested the complete opposite. Hamdun al-Qassar had perfected this to an art form that bordered on the supernatural. Hamdun would spend the entire night in zikr, weeping in remembrance of Allah until his eyes became rivers. At dawn, he would rub onions on his eyes to make them red and swollen, then appear in the marketplace looking as if he had spent the night drinking and carousing. When people accused him of debauchery, he would not deny it, but would nod sadly as if confirming their worst suspicions. Al-Sulami, Tabaqat al-Sufiya. The masters explain that when you allow others to think poorly of you for actions you haven't committed, you develop immunity to both false praise and false blame. Your self-worth becomes completely independent of social opinion. The science of strategic confession, Ilm al-Ittiraf al-Taqt Kai. They would confess to minor sins they hadn't committed in order to hide major spiritual achievements. Abu Hafs al-Haddad explains the profound psychology behind this. When you confess to a small darkness, people assume they have fathomed your depths. They stop looking deeper, and your light remains hidden from their corrupting gaze. Moreover, by claiming sins you haven't committed, you develop genuine humility about sins you might commit, and gratitude for being protected from sins you see in yourself as possibilities. What they didn't know was that Abu Amr had trained himself to enter muraqabah, the deepest mystical contemplation, in any position or circumstance. His apparent sleep during prayers was actually fana fil salah, complete absorption in the inner reality of worship. He was more present to the prayer than anyone in the mosque, but appeared to be the least present. The perfect Malamat appears to stumble while walking the straight path with absolute precision. He seems to be lost while guiding others to the destination. Practice of deliberate misunderstanding, ta'amud su al-fam. They would deliberately allow others to misinterpret their actions in the worst possible light. Ibn Arabi records witnessing this. I knew a man among them who would perform abundant charity, but always in ways that made him appear stingy. He would argue loudly with beggars about amounts, seeming to give reluctantly while actually giving more than they asked for. People saw the argument but not the generosity, heard the reluctance but not the abundance. Ibn Arabi, Al-Futuhat al-Makkiyah. The psychological insight was profound. When you systematically allow others to misunderstand your motives, you gradually stop caring about being understood at all. This leads to what they called istiqlal ruhan, spiritual independence. Here's what they discovered that made Orthodox scholars declare them heretical. The ultimate spiritual states can only be achieved when the seeker has absolutely zero investment in achieving them. They called this irada bila irada, will without will, or desire without desire. Al-Hallaj, shortly before his execution for claiming unity with God, revealed what may be the core secret of their path. The greatest veil between the servant and Allah is not his sins. Sins can be forgiven. The greatest veil is his good deeds. When he is pleased with his worship, he is veiled by it from the one who is truly worshipped. When he admires his spiritual state, he is cut off from the source of all states. Al-Hallaj, Kitab al-Tawasan. The Malamatiyya developed a technique so radical, it sounds like spiritual suicide. Kar al-nafs bil-nafs, conquering the ego by using the ego's own mechanisms against itself. Since the ego craves approval and recognition, they systematically starved it of both. Since the ego seeks to appear special, enlightened, or accomplished, they made it appear ordinary, confused, or even contemptible. But here's the terrifying paradox at the heart of their method. This technique only worked if the practitioner genuinely didn't care about the spiritual benefits it might bring. The moment you practice Malamat methods in order to become enlightened, to achieve mystical states, or even to become a better person, you've already failed completely. The method becomes just another form of spiritual ambition. As one anonymous master wrote in a manuscript preserved in the Suleymaniye library, the true Malamat is he who practices blame for no reason whatsoever, seeks no benefit from it in this world or the next, expects no spiritual fruit from it, and would continue the practice even if he knew with certainty it would bring him no reward and no realization. Only such a one can walk this path without being destroyed by it. They discovered something that modern psychology would later call the paradox of self-improvement. The harder you try to transcend ego, the stronger ego becomes through its very attempts at self-transcendence. Their solution was as radical as it was counterintuitive. Stop trying to transcend anything at all. The supreme masters of this path achieved something that sounds impossible until you witness it. They became completely indifferent to both praise and blame, success and failure, spiritual states and ordinary consciousness, while simultaneously becoming infinitely compassionate and responsive to the needs of every being around them. They had achieved what al-Bistami called fana and al-fana, extinction from extinction itself. First, I was non-existent and unconscious of my non-existence. Then I became existent and conscious of my existence. Now I am existent but unconscious of both existence and non-existence. I am drunk with the wine of love. The two worlds have completely vanished from my sight. Ibn Sina, the great philosopher-physician, records an encounter with one such master that illustrates the practical reality of their achievement. I observed him give his last coin to a beggar, then return home to sit calmly as his own family went without dinner that night. When I questioned him about this apparent contradiction, he replied, "Allah feeds all creatures according to his wisdom. To worry specifically about those connected to me by blood or circumstance would be to doubt his perfect provision and to favor some of his creation over others. My concern extends equally to all beings, which means it extends specifically to none." Ibn Sina, Kitab al-Isharat wal-Tanbihat. They had achieved what they called Sawa al-Ahwal, the complete equality of all spiritual and psychological states. The Malamatiyya path largely disappeared from Islamic mysticism because it proved simply too dangerous for all but the most exceptional souls. Al-Ghazali, who studied their methods intensively, wrote this warning. "This way is like handling pure fire while soaked in oil. Only the rarest souls, perhaps 1 in 10,000, can traverse it without being completely consumed. Most who attempt it fall into either antinomianism or despair." The masters themselves were fully aware of this danger. They established no formal schools, initiated very few students, and left deliberately incomplete written records. They knew that their path could either produce the most liberated saints or cause complete spiritual destruction. In our current age of spiritual performance, mystical credentials, and Instagram enlightenment, their radical commitment to invisibility offers perhaps the only authentic path to what they called al-fana al-haqq, true extinction in the divine reality. But as they would be the first to tell you, if you're practicing their methods in order to become anything at all, enlightened, liberated, or even a better person, you've already missed the point entirely. The path of blame can only be walked by those who have given up all hope of getting anywhere through walking it.